In this episode, we're going to explore how security leaders influence vendors, because a lot of modern security depends on systems and services you do not fully control. Beginners sometimes imagine that if your own environment is well secured, you are safe. But real organizations rely on software providers, cloud services, support partners, and third parties that handle data or connect into critical workflows. That means your security posture is partly shaped by agreements, expectations, and follow through with people outside your organization. Negotiation can sound like a business skill that is unrelated to security, but it is actually one of the most practical ways to reduce risk because it determines what the vendor must do, what you can verify, and what happens if something goes wrong. The core idea is that you negotiate security outcomes by being clear about requirements, demanding evidence that those requirements are met, and using leverage to make the vendor take your needs seriously. By the end, you should understand what it means to negotiate outcomes rather than promises, why evidence matters more than reassuring language, and how leverage works even when you are not the biggest customer in the room. A good place to start is defining what a vendor is in this context, because vendor risk shows up in many forms. A vendor might be a company that provides a cloud-based application you use, a contractor that supports your systems, a platform that stores your data, or a service that integrates with your tools. The key security question is not whether the vendor is reputable. It is whether the vendor's practices and controls match the risk created by your relationship with them. If the vendor processes personal data, handles authentication, or has privileged access to your environment, then a vendor weakness can become your incident. Even if the vendor does not directly touch sensitive data, they might still affect availability, integrity, or operational resilience. This is why security leaders treat vendor relationships as part of the overall system boundary. The boundary is not just your network. It includes external dependencies that can influence outcomes. When you negotiate with vendors, you are shaping those dependencies so they are less likely to fail you when it matters. Requirements are the first tool in negotiation because they turn vague desires into specific expectations. A requirement is a statement of what must be true, such as encryption for stored data, strong authentication for access, logging of key events, timely patching, or incident notification within a defined time. Beginners often confuse requirements with preferences, but a requirement is something you would be willing to walk away over if it cannot be met. Good requirements also connect to risk, meaning you can explain why the requirement exists and what harm it prevents. This matters because vendors receive many requests, and the ones that are grounded in clear risk tend to be taken more seriously. Requirements should also be testable, meaning you can gather evidence to confirm whether they are met. If a requirement is written in a way that cannot be measured, it becomes difficult to enforce. Negotiating requirements is not about being aggressive. It is about being clear so both sides understand what security outcome is expected. To make requirements effective, you need to avoid two common mistakes: making them too generic or making them so detailed they become unrealistic. If you say the vendor must have strong security, the vendor can agree without changing anything, because strong is subjective. If you specify every technical detail down to how the vendor must implement their systems, you may create conflict because vendors often cannot change their architecture for one customer. The practical middle ground is to specify outcomes and control objectives, such as requiring encryption, access control, monitoring, and incident response capabilities, while allowing the vendor flexibility in how they achieve them. You can also prioritize requirements based on impact, because not all requirements are equally critical. For a system that stores sensitive data, confidentiality requirements might be non-negotiable. For a tool that is low sensitivity, availability might matter more than advanced security features. Clear prioritization helps negotiation because it focuses energy on what truly reduces risk rather than on collecting security features like trophies. Evidence is the second tool, and it is what separates meaningful vendor security from marketing language. A vendor can claim they take security seriously, but evidence shows whether that claim is supported by real controls and real practice. Evidence might include independent audit reports, documented security policies, proof of encryption and access control design, vulnerability management summaries, incident response procedures, and records of how security issues are handled. The goal is not to drown in paperwork. It is to obtain enough trustworthy information to reduce uncertainty. Beginners should understand that evidence needs to match the risk and the relationship. If a vendor only provides a generic statement and refuses to share any evidence, that is a signal that you may not be able to trust their security maturity, especially for high-impact dependencies. Evidence should also be current, because an old report may not reflect the vendor's present reality. When you ask for evidence, you are not accusing the vendor. You are doing the normal work of assurance. Evidence is also a negotiation tool because it creates accountability. If a vendor provides evidence of controls, you can point back to it later if something changes. Evidence can also reveal gaps, such as missing monitoring, unclear incident notification processes, or weak access management for administrative accounts. Those gaps become negotiation points where you can request remediation or compensating controls. Importantly, evidence is not only about technical controls, it is also about process maturity. A vendor might have strong encryption but weak incident response, which means you might be left in the dark during a breach. A vendor might have strong policies but poor operational discipline, which means controls drift and problems linger. Evidence helps you assess whether the vendor can reliably sustain secure behavior over time. For beginners, the core lesson is simple. Trust is not granted by confidence. It is earned by proof. Leverage is the third tool, and it can sound uncomfortable, but it is simply the reality that negotiation outcomes depend on incentives and options. Leverage means your ability to influence the vendor's behavior, and that influence can come from several sources. One source is your ability to choose another vendor, which is sometimes called having alternatives. Another source is the business value you represent, such as contract size, brand impact, or strategic partnership potential. Another source is the vendor's desire to access your market or maintain reputation. Even when you are a small customer, you often have leverage through clarity and preparedness because vendors prefer customers who know what they need and can complete deals efficiently. Leverage also comes from timing, such as negotiating requirements before you are fully dependent, because it is easier to influence terms at the start than after integration is complete. A key beginner insight is that leverage is not about threats. It is about aligning incentives so the vendor sees security as part of delivering value rather than as a nuisance. When vendors understand that security affects whether they win or keep your business, they pay attention. One way to think about leverage in a healthy way is to focus on outcomes that are mutually beneficial. For example, a vendor that improves logging and monitoring not only helps you, but also reduces their own incident response time. A vendor that strengthens access control reduces the chance their platform is abused, which protects their reputation. A vendor that commits to timely notification reduces confusion and legal risk for both parties. When you frame requirements as part of reliable service delivery, negotiations tend to be smoother because the vendor can see business value. However, it is also important to recognize that some vendors will only move when pressure exists, especially if the request requires effort. This is where leverage must be real, such as being willing to delay adoption, reduce scope, or select a different provider if critical requirements cannot be met. Security leaders sometimes fail negotiation not because they asked for too much, but because they asked without being prepared to act if the vendor refuses. Leverage is the bridge between what you want and what the vendor will actually do. A common beginner misconception is that vendor negotiations are only about a checklist of security features, but the real target is reducing risk in specific ways. If you focus on outcomes, you can tailor the conversation to what matters most. For instance, if the major risk is unauthorized access to your data, the negotiation should emphasize access control, audit logging, and strong authentication. If the major risk is data loss or corruption, the negotiation should emphasize backup integrity, recovery capabilities, and change controls. If the major risk is availability, the negotiation should emphasize resilience and incident communication. Requirements, evidence, and leverage all support outcome-focused negotiation. Requirements define what outcomes must be achieved. Evidence shows whether the vendor is capable and willing, and leverage makes the outcome more likely to happen. Beginners should think of this as a structured conversation, not a battle. Your job is to create clarity, reduce uncertainty, and ensure the relationship does not silently increase your risk. Another important aspect is understanding that vendor security negotiation is not a one-time event. It continues throughout the relationship. Vendors change their platforms, update their terms, and sometimes acquire other companies or shift their support models. If you only negotiate at the beginning and never revisit expectations, drift can occur, and your security posture can weaken without you noticing. This is why good agreements include mechanisms for ongoing assurance, such as periodic evidence updates and clear notification of material changes. From a beginner perspective, the key point is that trust must be maintained, not just established. When a vendor relationship becomes critical, you want a routine where security questions are normal and evidence sharing is expected. This reduces friction because everyone knows what the relationship requires. It also reduces the chance of surprise, like learning about an incident or a major control change after the fact. Continuous engagement is part of negotiating outcomes, because outcomes are sustained behavior, not just initial promises. It is also useful to talk about how to handle pushback, because vendors often respond with statements like they meet industry standards or they cannot share details. Pushback is not always a sign of bad faith. Sometimes it is about protecting intellectual property or managing workload. The key is to return to outcomes and evidence. If a vendor cannot share detailed technical designs, they might still share independent assessments, summaries of controls, or explanations of how they manage key risks. If a vendor says a requirement is too hard, you can explore compensating controls, which are alternative protections that reduce risk in a different way. If a vendor refuses to provide evidence entirely, you should treat that as a risk signal and decide whether the relationship is appropriate for sensitive use. Negotiation is not about winning every point. It is about making informed risk decisions and documenting them. Beginners should understand that sometimes the outcome of negotiation is choosing not to proceed, and that is a valid security decision when risk cannot be reduced to an acceptable level. A practical way to summarize the whole approach is to imagine you are buying a service that will hold something valuable for you, like a safe deposit box in a building you do not own. Requirements are the rules you need the building to follow, like who can access the box and how access is logged. Evidence is the proof that the building actually follows those rules, like inspection reports and access records. Leverage is what ensures the building takes your rules seriously, like your willingness to use a different building if the rules are not met. In cloud and vendor relationships, the valuables are often data and operational dependencies. The negotiation is how you ensure the building operates safely, not just how it looks on the outside. When you hold this analogy, you can see why security outcomes cannot be achieved by trust alone. Outcomes come from a combination of clear expectations, verified controls, and real incentives to maintain those controls. As we close, remember that negotiating security outcomes with vendors is an essential part of modern security leadership because your environment is interconnected with external services and partners. Requirements give you clarity about what must be true to reduce risk and protect confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Evidence transforms vendor claims into verifiable assurance, helping you see both strengths and gaps without relying on marketing language. Leverage turns the conversation into action by aligning incentives and giving your requirements weight, especially when changes require effort. When these three are used together, negotiations become more structured and less emotional, and vendor relationships become safer and more predictable. This is not about demanding perfection. It is about creating a relationship where security is treated as part of delivering the service, supported by proof, and sustained over time. That is how you reduce vendor-driven risk without slowing your organization to a crawl.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.